Hello, BookTube. We're forging on with Boldly Govember, the read-along that was created by Matt at Paperback Junkie for the month of November to celebrate all things Star Trek, in which, in order to qualify, all you have to do is read a Star Trek book of any kind. It could be a comic book for all he cares. He's a specialist in easy, flippin' read-alongs, and this one certainly qualifies. I have subjected it to a kind of rogue radiation blast Gojira mutation where I've been doing many videos instead of only one. And some of them touch only lightly on books. So I am distorting Boldly Govember all out of recognition. And that certainly applied yesterday. Yesterday we talked about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, an iteration of the show that ran for a long time and that generated a lot of books, not many of which were noteworthy. And shortly after Deep Space Nine, the powers that be at the studio decided to make another Star Trek television show, Star Trek Voyager. And once again, as with Deep Space Nine and with Star Trek The Next Generation, there was a handoff. The informal tradition here was to link one show to the next with some kind of handoff. In this case, two crewmen who have been assigned to the USS Voyager, who stopped by Deep Space Nine and Quark's establishment, the establishment of the Ferengi barkeep in Deep Space Nine, on their way to their assignment. And Star Trek Voyager was meant to be just as much of an envelope pusher as some aspects of Deep Space Nine. Some of those innovations are obvious right away. In fact, one is every bit as immediately obvious as the fact that Avery Brooks was cast, that a black man was cast as a commander, on the head authority figure on a Star Trek show, and eventually a captain. And that is that in Star Trek Voyager, the captain is a woman. Catherine Janeway, played by the great Kate Mulgrew, who takes command of the vessel, Voyager, in complicated circumstances. Her best friend, a 100-plus-year-old Vulcan named Tuvok, has gone undercover on a terrorist ship, an insurgent ship, in an attempt to, ferret out their secrets and eventually turn them over to the Federation. And the captain of that ship is a Marquis, a Star Trek version of insurgent terrorists, called Chakotay, and his chief engineer is a half-human, half-Klingon woman named B'Elanna Torres. And at the beginning of Voyager, in the very first episode, all of these people, a lot of the Marquis, Tuvok, and the entire starship Voyager, are hurled over 70,000 light years across the galaxy into the Delta Quadrant, by a gigantic, all-powerful alien called the Caretaker, who has set up a mechanical array that is sending out these pulse beams that basically abduct life forms at random from all parts of the galaxy, in an attempt to find genetic stock that will allow the Caretaker to perpetuate his own kind. It's kind of vague. It's a little bit over-elaborate. But it leads to the crucial plot and conceptual difference in Star Trek Voyager, which happens right in the first episode. Because in the first episode, after Captain Janeway has realized what's going on and how far away they are from home, and that all sorts of people are involved in not just her own crew, she makes a classic Starfleet captain decision that she would rather destroy the Caretaker's array than allow it to continue abducting species and also hurting one particular planet. And she does. The question is asked in that first episode, who are you to make that decision? And the answer is given. She's the captain. And she destroys the Caretaker array, knowing perfectly well that it's the only way she knows of that can ever get her back home in any length of time. I mean, it would take them 60, 70 years at maximum warp to get all the way back to the Federation. So the very youngest people on board Voyager might be alive at the end of that time. But and the Vulcan, Tuvok, might still be alive at the end of that time. But it's a death sentence as far as she knows, unless they can find other technology or another caretaker or something to get them back home. And that is the first episode of Voyager. 2 crews thrown together. Janeway makes the impulsive and extremely insightful decision to make Chakotay her first officer. Not in a ceremonial sense either, but a literal working part of the crew, the next highest officer after her. So the Marquis have every reason to fall in line, to throw in their lot with Starfleet, so that they can all survive. And eventually, B'Elanna Torres becomes the head engineer of Voyager. And the rest of the crew is, once again, as with Star Trek The Next Generation and as with Deep Space Nine, the rest of the crew is a hat tip all around to diversity and to unpredictability. Not only do you have a female captain, but you have a half Klingon engineer, you have a Vulcan security officer. There are 2 aliens who are brought on board. They're not part of Starfleet, but they are passengers for a while. And also, in a decision that could have been a dead end, but is once again saved by a fantastic actor, the ship gets to the Delta Quadrant without a doctor. And so they engage in the emergency medical hologram, which is, there are hollow emitters, solid light emitters designed in sickbay to create a holographic doctor who is loaded with all of the medical and biological information that have of a million textbooks, and is designed as a short-term stopgap emergency measure until a new doctor can be found. They bring the online doctor on board. He doesn't have a name, and he doesn't have a particularly good bedside manner. He is clearly a short-term thing. But they can't afford to have him be short-term. They're just going to have to keep running his program. And that leads... The odyssey of the Doctor as a character is wonderful and leads to some wonderful moments. And the actor has a deadpan sense of humor. So that is always, always wonderful. And you can see by that description what the major innovation of Star Trek Voyager is. The major innovation is not a woman as a captain. And, you know, the starship, Voyager itself, is not a Galaxy-class starship. It is not a ship of the line, much like the Defiant in Deep Space Nine. It's a smaller kind of vessel, but that doesn't matter either. No, the main innovation for Star Trek Voyager is the imposition of a plot. Not a plot for each weekly episode, but a plot for the whole thing, for the whole story. That is, first of all, it's never done in the original show. In Star Trek The Next Generation, it's, I would argue, never done. In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, a plot, an overarching plot that binds the whole of the show together, only emerged once the Dominion War started. Then there was a larger plot into which each episode fit. But only then, and that was just a few seasons. Usually, the gimmick, the setup, the conceit of Star Trek is episodic, quite literally. It's that every new week you have a new adventure and you can hop on at any time. Voyager changed all that in some ways. Voyager, of course, still has weekly adventures, new planets, new civilizations, new troubles and mysteries to get into. But there is, it's all done against the backdrop of a larger plot, which is that Captain Janeway is absolutely determined to get her crew home. And not in 70 years, to find a way to get home. They, of course, point their nose straight at Federation space and head there at high warp. But that's not all they're going to do. They're going to have adventures, they're going to stop, they're going to need to refuel and barter for all kinds of things. And they also, touchingly and presciently for the rest of the show, I'll get to that, they also don't want to abandon their duties as Starfleet officers to explore. They're in the midst of totally unknown space. But that overarching plot line, getting the crew home, heading back home, it's never brooded seriously that Voyager will ever abandon that quest. It's instead, that is the background, the backdrop for the whole thing. And the other sort of episode by episode overarching difference in Star Trek Voyager is again obvious, which is that Voyager is completely cut off from any kind of support system. No Starfleet, no other ships, nothing. They are alone. in the Delta Quadrant, surrounded by alien races, some of whom are friendly, some of whom are very much unfriendly, some of whom are weak, some of whom are very powerful, and eventually, of course, those of you who are Star Trek The Next Generation fans, certainly at the time that Voyager was unspooling episode by episode, season by season, there are plenty of Next Generation fans who were just waiting for it to happen. Of course, the biggest bombshell of all is the most famous denizens of the Delta Quadrant, the Borg. It's inevitable that sooner or later Voyager will encounter the Borg, and they do. And that leads to a whole bunch of great moments and great character development between all of the characters, and also the introduction of a new character. Voyager picks up a new character. They pick up a Borg. They detach a Borg from the collective. And her designation in the Borg collective was 7 of 9. And they just leave her. They just give her that name. That is still her name. They figure out from Starfleet records what her human name is, but they don't ever use it. They just call her 7. And the actress does a wonderful job. The actress who plays 7 of 9 does a wonderful job. All sorts of cynics made all sorts of comments about why she was hired for the show. She was extremely beautiful. But I was cynical about that myself. And then I watched the performance that she gave in her first 5 episodes and thought, okay, well, I'm on board. Absolutely. And also, the actress who played 7 of 9 was gracious enough to accept a sort of a characterization, an ongoing characterization, as a sort of a tempestuous child-parent relationship with Captain Janeway, which I think worked really well. I think both actresses, I don't know anything about this. I don't know anything about backstage Voyager. I get the distinct impression from their body language, even in their best scenes together, that they didn't particularly like each other. But it didn't matter. Total professionals, the both of them. And Voyager ran for the whole 7 years and was tremendously good. I know that it gets low marks from a lot of Star Trek fans, and I'm not completely sure why, except maybe that one of the aliens that I mentioned who aren't Starfleet, who are picked up at the beginning and go along for a few seasons, one of those, the ship's morale officer and cook named Neelix, is rather, fingers on chalkboard grading at times. So maybe that was the reason. I don't think that would be good enough reason. And certainly if you look beyond that, I think Voyager is extremely good. It has some of the worst episodes of any Star Trek iteration up to that point. Don't get me wrong. It's not all roses and dilithium crystals, but its good episodes are fantastically good. And there's a long string of them. Very much different from what I said about Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager, both in the course of 7 seasons, field a solid 24 really first-rate episodes. And you would think, with such a various cast and with such an inherently dramatic premise, a lone ship trying to get back to the Federation, you would think that the novels would be outstanding, because, of course, immediately the studio authorized novels to come out. And they aren't. They largely aren't. I was going to say, before Thanksgiving, I was going to say that there were no good Voyager novels. I thought I'd read them all. But when I was in Vermont for Thanksgiving, Mark at Richardson Ruth recommended The Murdered Son by Christy Golden. And I had read it before, I could swear. But I read it again, and I liked it. It isn't, as he would be the first to admit, it's not great. It's not even really, in the broader scheme of things, particularly good. It's just smoothly competent. It is considerably better along those lines than most Voyager novels. Oh my God, most of the ones to the left and right of it in publication history are just awful. Just awful. And even The Murdered Son is a little on the flat side. It has some nice moments to it. There was a tremendous carefulness about all of the Voyager novels that came out, and even the most ambitious ones, like Pathways, for instance, by Jerry Taylor. And Pathways had sort of a companion volume. What was it called? Decisions or something like that. But Pathways sold a lot. It was a big deal. It had mainstream authorized Star Trek's very first gay relationship, but it was stodgy. It's big and intricate and dull, And Jerry Taylor was unfortunately the best that Voyager writers had to offer, and even there the work was competent, maybe a little bit better than competent, but no soaringly fantastic Voyager novel, unfortunately. And geez, they haven't stopped trying. Voyager novels are still made, even though Voyager, like Deep Space Nine, and unlike Star Trek The Next Generation or Star Trek The Original Series, both Deep Space Nine and Voyager had endings as well as beginnings. Totally unheard of in an ongoing, weekly, year-to-year, season-by-season science fiction series. Deep Space Nine has a rather dramatic ending. The final episode of Deep Space Nine is indelibly sad. Everyone leaves. Our wonderful cast and crew, who had such chemistry and adventures together, go to the four winds, and they might talk about, someday, maybe, somehow, but they're never going to see each other again, most of them. And Voyager's ending was written in the stars, as it were, because Voyager's got to get home. I mean, by the time Voyager was running, Gene Roddenberry was long dead, but it didn't matter. Some things in Star Trek never change, and if you have a Starfleet vessel stranded on the other side of the galaxy, it has to get home in your final episode. That's all there is to it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to spoil the two-part final episode. It is incredibly good. They chose a fantastic way to do it, and keep you on the edge of the seat right to the end. And it's touching, and it's well acted. One of the things you notice in Voyager, I think probably because of Kate Mulgrew's presence, is that some of the acting is tremendously good. Some of the just episode by episode, scene by scene stuff is just really well done. But you would think that if Voyager gets home and that's it, that there would be no more Voyager novels, because the crew would go their own ways. They wouldn't stay together on Voyager. Of course, Voyager is out of date by the time it gets back home. But that doesn't stop people from writing novels. As far as I know, I haven't really kept up with it, but as far as I know, the Voyager novels have Voyager going back to the Delta Quadrant. This time intentionally. I haven't followed it because it's not canonical. It's not set in the time period of the show. And I don't think anyone would bother to write a lost episode of Star Trek Voyager. Fan fiction, maybe, but not otherwise. And so Deep Space Nine and Voyager, they ended their run on TV, and they killed their possibilities for novels. And that means that what you have is what we get, and that leaves a very slim pickings for Deep Space Nine and nothing for Voyager. I would love it if the studio ever thought that maybe there was money involved in licensing people to write something or other about Voyager. Let's stick to Voyager for instance. Leave Deep Space Nine alone. I mentioned last time that the great novel for Deep Space Nine would be Jake Sisko writing the whole story of his time on the station. And with Voyager, something very similar is possible. Many similar things are possible, and no one's ever done them, and I don't think anyone will. It's a long gone and finished Star Trek series. I don't see why anyone would ever license a novel to tell, for instance, Tuvok's story from beginning to end, or Janeway's story. Janeway immediately becomes an admiral. Anything like that, I would love it, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. Which means that when it comes to Star Trek Voyager, which is one of my favorite Star Trek iterations, I don't have anything written to recommend to you. I have one exception that I will mention later on, maybe in a day or two here as we wrap up Boldly Govember. But it's a short story, and it doesn't really count. So that is my Boldly Govember for today. Just an overview of Star Trek Voyager, and sort of an explanation for why there are no books. There are no books to talk about. We'll continue to talk about books. I'm hoping this will be the only Boldly Govember where we never talk about any books. I mentioned some. I can't honestly recommend them, even if you find them. And the ones that are coming out now are just basically they're fan fiction on steroids. So you could, if you read them all, you might get caught up in the storyline, but it's not. It's not a Star Trek Voyager novel in the sense of the Voyager that we know, the show that we watched. And that moves us on. That moves us on next time beyond Voyager. So this is just going to get a little hairier, and then we'll finish up. We'll never talk about Star Trek again. No, I probably will still talk about Star Trek quite a bit. But I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll get back to Star Trek tomorrow, I hope. Hopefully with books to talk about. But in the meantime, I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.